Either the third millennium will be a spiritual age, or there will be no third millennium. So wrote the prominent French novelist André Malraux. Similarly, Dag Hammarskjöld, the first Secretary General of the United Nations, warned more than 30 years ago when he said, quote, "Unless the world has a spiritual rebirth, civilization is doomed." In our age of collapsing ideologies, shifting economies, changing politics, and moral confusion, the admonitions of Hammarskjöld and Malraux take on an added sense of urgency and of poignancy. At our moment in history, it has become incredibly difficult to find an anchor. Or, as the Hasidic master Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav once said in Yiddish, "Der Welt is a dreidel." The world is a spinning top. And in such a world, even finding one's own self often becomes an elusive endeavor. It was in this regard that the 19th century Hasidic master in Poland, Rabbi Hanoch of Alexander in Polish is Alexandrów, which is a town near Lodz or Łódź, once told this story. Once there was a man who, like many of us, would wake up in the morning and would forget where he put his clothing when he went to bed the night before. One night, before going to sleep, this man devised a solution to his problem. Before he got into bed, he took paper and pencil and he wrote himself a note. And the note said, "Dear me, the eyeglasses are on the table next to the bed, the pants are on the chair next to the table, the shirt is over the pants, the shoes are under the bed, and I am in the bed. Cordially, me." The next morning he awoke and he took his list, and to his amazement he found everything that he was looking for: his eyeglasses, his pants, his shirt, and his shoes. But then he went to look for the last item on the list, namely himself. And when he went to find himself in the bed, he wasn't there. So he sighed and he said, "I found everything but myself. So if I'm not in the bed, then where am I?" The spiritual quest is a forthright confrontation with the fundamental questions of human existence, such as, where am I? Who am I? Where should I go? What am I doing here? And what should I be doing here? It was the Hasidic master Rabbi Israel of Rizhin who once prayed, "Dear God, I don't ask you to explain to me why the world was created. I don't ask you to explain to me why the good suffer and why the evil prosper. Only please, God, tell me, what am I doing here in this world of yours?" The spiritual legacy of Polish Jewry offers us a series of maps and charts for a spiritual rebirth, for a way of responding to these most crucial questions, not only for Jews, but for members of all peoples. Among the primary goals of Jewish spirituality, especially as it developed in Poland, are number one, the consummation of a romance with the divine. Number two, the creation of life as a work of art. Number three, encountering a source of meaning in that which transcends us. And number four, deepening the consciousness of our own self-understanding. And within Jewish spirituality, four often converging primary paths are envisioned as propelling us toward these goals. And these paths are, number one, the Word, number two, the world, number 3, the deed, and number 4, the self. Let's now look at these 4 themes. First, the self. The spiritual quest demands candid introspection. For example, it is told that once Rabbi Yitzchak of Vorki is the Yiddish word for the Polish town Warka, once he spent the Sabbath with a simple Jewish farmer. The farmer asked the rabbi to teach him some Torah, but the rabbi was curious as to what he could learn from the farmer. That particular week, the scriptural reading, the Parshat HaShavua, began with the words, "See I," namely God, in Hebrew, Re'eh Anochi, "See I, God, have set before you this day the blessing and the curse." It's a verse in Deuteronomy 11:26. The farmer thought about the possible meaning of the first 2 words of the verse, Re'eh Anochi, see I. And all of a sudden the farmer said to the rabbi in Polish, Patrz sobie, meaning, see the eye, namely, look at yourself. The rabbi of Vorki was so impressed with this insight that he would quote it to his disciples each year when this verse was read in the synagogue. In other words, the spiritual pilgrimage commences with the inward gaze, with the individual's encounter with his or her own self. The rabbi of Kotsk, a town near Lublin, was once asked, why do human beings have 2 eyes rather than 1 eye or 3 eyes? He said, we have 2 eyes because 1 eye is for looking out at the world, but the other eye is for looking inward at the self. Following earlier Jewish mystics, the rabbi of Kutsk taught that in our world, truth is veiled, it's incomplete, that each grain of truth is surrounded by shells of falsehood, and that the goal of life is to encounter the truth beyond the veils of illusion. And in his view, the greatest obstacles in the search for truth are self-delusion and self-deception. That is, living a lie and taking it to be the truth. For the rabbi of Kutsk, truth means sincerity, honesty, integrity. It means not simply trying to define the truth or to uncover the truth, but rather to live the truth. Truth means doing what we say. It means living our stated commitments. It means becoming our convictions. Consequently, life in this view is a perilous task because one must try to navigate between truth and illusion, between appearance and reality, between self-realization and self-delusion. Once his teacher, Rabbi Bunema Pshischa, was asked, who is a chassid? Who is a pious person? And he answered, a chassid is one who does more than the law requires. And so he was again asked, and what does the law require? His answer was, Scripture commands us in Leviticus, you should not deceive your neighbor. He was then asked, if that's the law, what is required of the chassid? And his answer was, to go above the law. The law is you cannot deceive your neighbor. If you go above the law, you will not deceive your own self. Since no 2 people are the same, each individual needs to know themselves well in order to be able to prescribe the most effective dosages when formulating his or her prescription for spiritual therapy. And this requires not only constant introspection, but sincere and even brutal self-analysis. And in this process, complacency and pride are formidable stumbling blocks which must be overcome. Polish Hasidism considered pride to be inimical to spiritual development for three major reasons. First, because pride is self-deceptive, and spiritual development is always sabotaged by self-deception. Pride tricks us into thinking that we are more important than we really are. It fools us into believing that we have no faults and no shortcomings. Arrogance stifles the process of self-improvement by convincing us that we are too good to improve. It does not therefore allow us to see ourselves as we really are. Secondly, pride is dangerous because it stifles relationships. The ego stands as a barrier, restricting our ability to transcend ourselves in order for us to be able to forge a relationship with someone else, especially with God. Pride is also dangerous because it is self-destructive and destructive of the relationships we might already have. And thirdly, pride is dangerous because it is the worst possible sin. For Hasidism, pride is a form of the greatest sin of all, namely idolatry. Because idolatry means treating something other than God as if it were God. And pride means treating one's own ego as if it were God. Because the arrogant person worships only his own needs or own self. What then is humility for the Polish Hasidim? Humility being the opposite of pride. For some, humility is an exercise in self-depreciation that serves as the necessary prelude to moral improvement. But while some of the Hasidic masters shared this view, others took humility to entail recognizing one's abilities, accepting one's achievements, acknowledging one's accomplishments, but not making too big a deal about them, and not using them as a means of lording over others or as a means of a barrier between oneself and others. For as the early Hasidic master Menachem Nachum of Chernobyl put it, rather than restricting us, humility liberates the individual from egocentricity, thereby allowing an individual to expand consciousness and to embrace limitless possibilities made inaccessible by the restraints of the sometimes inflated human ego. It was the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, who censored not only pride, but also sadness and depression. Anticipating the psychoanalytic theories of Professor Heinz Kohut of the University of Chicago by almost 2 centuries, he considered psychological depression to be the flip side of pride. In other words, pride is ego obsession where we inflate ourselves beyond all realistic proportions, but depression is another form of ego obsession where we deflate ourselves beyond all realistic proportions. Manifested either as pride or depression, ego obsession is self-deceiving, self-defeating, obstructive to creativity, and to the formulation of authentic relationships. A major teaching of many of the Polish masters, such as Mordechai Joseph Lehner of Ishbitza, related to the need to control one's anger, because he considered anger to be simply a form or expression of pride, and hence inimical to faith. Anger was considered an expression of egocentricity, but more dangerous than other forms of pride, because unlike other forms of pride that harm only the self, anger often harms others as well. The Jewish mystics, for many centuries, taught that the human soul is a part of God. That is, that the human soul is divine. This means that the divine may be encountered not only by going out to the world, but also by going inward to the self. In this view, therefore, self-understanding, knowing oneself, knowing one's own soul, inevitably entails communion with God. In their view, the process of self-knowledge begins with the battle against arrogance and against pride. But even the eclipse of God's presence, even the hiding of God, is considered to be an invitation to divine communion. It is told, for example, that the grandson of Rabbi Boruch of Mezhbish, in Polish Medzuborz, was once playing hide and seek with a friend. The boy, the grandson, stayed in his hiding place, assuming that his friend would come and look for him. But after waiting for a long time, it was clear that his friend had decided not to try to find him. And so the boy, the grandson, ran into the study of his grandfather, Rabbi Boruch, complaining about his friend and crying about how his own hiding had been in vain. But upon hearing the story, the grandfather, Rabbi Boruch, suddenly began to cry. The boy asked, "Grandfather, why do you cry?" And Rabbi Boruch says, "Because God too says, 'I hide, but will no one come and look for me?'" In this view, life is an adventure of hiding and seeking, of finding and losing, of quest and encounter. But not only the soul, but also the body can serve as the place for a rendezvous with God. While it is indisputable that strong ascetic trends are found throughout Jewish history, including Polish Jewish history, it is also evident that without the body, it would be impossible to serve God. The claim that individual spiritual development can and should be cultivated through the body, as well, of course, as through the soul, found a strong resonance in Polish Hasidism. That the most mundane physical actions could serve as conduits to spiritual self-development is articulated in the Hasidic concept of divine worship through materiality, what in Hebrew is called avodah shebagashmiut. The Baal Shem Tov taught that a person is able both to further his or her own spiritual development and even to bring about unification of the divine forces in the world and in the supernal realm by the performance of the most mundane, most physical actions, such as eating, drinking, sexual relations, business activities, and social interaction between friends. In this view, all human experience, no matter how mundane, has the potential of enabling an individual to liberate and elevate sacred sparks that relate to one's own self, to one's own soul. In this view, the most routine act can become a vehicle to the divine. The most prosaic act can become a redemptive deed. Consider, for example, in this regard, the Baal Shem Tov's interpretation of a verse in Job, which says, "From my flesh I shall see God. Mivsari echazeh Eloha." On this verse, "From my flesh I see God," the Baal Shem Tov comments, and these are his words, "From the greatest physical pleasure, that is the pleasure of the sexual organ, one causes pleasure above, namely to God. This pleasure comes about when man and woman unite, and this brings about unification above. Through the physical, we perceive the spiritual." In other words, not only the soul, but also the human body was considered a vehicle to self-knowledge and hence also to the knowledge of God. But not only the physical body, but also the physical world, nature, can serve as a path to spiritual fulfillment and as an entree to the divine. Encountering the natural world is a path on the spiritual journey. In their view, the world is a disguise worn by God, and our task is to unmask God. Our task is to find God beneath his disguise, to seek him in the game of hide and seek. Rabbi Tzadok of Lublin once said, The world is like a book, and by encounter with the book, one comes in contact with the divine author of the book. And so we see that the self, entering the self, is one path on the spiritual journey. And we see that the world, encounter with the world, is a second. The third path is the encounter with the sacred word. Prayer and study are actions in which the self meets the word. The sacred word is therefore a rendezvous point for the meeting of the human soul and the divine. For the Polish Jew, God was not an inaccessible monarch, hidden in an impregnable fortress, but rather God was a constant companion, easily accessible, always available, sometimes distant, but never remote. For example, of the Hasidic master Rabbi Israel of Koznitz, or in Polish Kozienice, it is told that when he prayed to God in the solitude of his room, he would address God over and over in Polish with the words Moje kochanku, which means my darling. And when a disciple of the Rabbi of Kutsk informed his master that the Rabbi of Lubavitch taught Gott is in Himmel Arain, God dwells in the heaven, the Rabbi of Kutsk replied, Nein, Gott is in Pipuk Arain, God dwells in our guts. Study of the sacred and classical texts of Jewish tradition was a central preoccupation of the Polish Jew, not only by scholars, but also by lay people as well. It is told, for example, that a certain scholar awakened in the middle of the night, perplexed by a passage in the Talmud he couldn't understand. He mulled over the text in his mind for many hours, trying to figure out its meaning. And finally, unable to sleep, he decided to go in the middle of the night to the study house to see if a solution could be found by studying the commentaries on that passage in the library in the study house. And so he washed and he dressed and he went out into the darkness. A bitterly cold wind encouraged him to hasten his steps. Shortly he arrived at the study house, looked on the bookshelf, found a book which had a promising commentary on the very text that troubled him. He opened the book. He found the relevant passage, which would be the answer to his problem. And then he went to sit down to study the passage. But what was his problem? He couldn't find a seat, because each chair in the study house was already preoccupied with someone who was already sitting there studying in the middle of the night. For the Polish Jew, there could be no spiritual achievement without intensive study of the tradition, because spiritual development and Jewish cultural illiteracy are mutually exclusive. For Polish Hasidism, though, study that does not enhance self-knowledge, learning that does not bring about spiritual self-transformation, is a non sequitur. And in this regard, Rabbi Mendel of Kutsk is reputed to have said the following to a scholar who was erudite, knew a lot, but nothing more. The Rabbi of Kutsk said, "What good is understanding a text if one does not thereby attain a better understanding of one's own self?" It is also told that once an eminent scholar approached the Rabbi of Kutsk, and the scholar boasted that he had gone through the entire Talmud twice. The Rabbi of Kutsk was unimpressed, and he answered the scholar by saying, "So, you've gone through the Talmud twice, but how much of the Talmud has gone through you?" No passive voyeur, no casual tourist surveying the landscape of learning. The student of the Torah is one committed to live what he or she learns. Now, quality of religious observance, and not only quantity of religious observance, became a significant factor in the spiritual life of Polish Jewry. Hasidism taught that a person could all too easily fall into the trap of believing that he or she had attained righteousness through religious observance or involvement in communal affairs. But even externally holy behavior, in their view, could be tainted. For example, commenting on the verse in Leviticus 7:1, "This is the law of the guilt offering. It is most holy," Rabbi Mendel of Kutsk observed, it means, where is guilt to be found? Precisely in the most holy. In other words, from this perspective, observance with ulterior motives, observance that does not lead to God, may be compared to a body without a soul. For the Jewish mystics, the sacred deed helps redeem not only ourselves, but also the divine presence in the world. We, in a sense, help redeem God. And this human partnership with God is articulated through the performance of sacred deeds. And now we come to the fourth path. Deeds articulate commitments. Sacred deeds express faith, and they engender communion with God, called in Hebrew devekut. Through faith, a person becomes elevated beyond the realm of the senses. Faith allows us to perceive more than the eyes can see, more than the mind can grasp. Through faith, one becomes able to penetrate the veils of illusion. Faith offers the ability to perceive the light buried in the darkness, to see the truth buried in illusion. Faith thereby becomes an act of liberation, of redemption, of revelation. Faith means revealing the concealed. Now, in Exodus 14:31, there is a verse, "And Israel saw the great work that God did upon the Egyptians, and the people feared God, and they had faith in God and his servant Moses." On this verse, Rabbi Israel Meir of Ger, or in Polish Gura Kalvaria, one of the most popular of all the Polish masters, commented this way. He said, although the people saw the miracles of God with their own eyes, yet they were still in need of faith. Why? Because faith is superior to sight. Because with faith, you see more than you can possibly see with your eyes. In other words, in one sense, to see is to believe. But for Rabbi Yitzhak Meir of Ger, to believe is really to see. Faith embraces a polarity between words and deeds, beliefs and actions. Faith also combines mind and emotion, intellectual assent with existential commitment. But faith never, in Judaism, demands an abrogation of the intellect or a surrendering of the mind. There is a verse in the Proverbs, "Is there a man of reason who seeks God?" which the Rabbi of Kutsk took to mean a man who has nothing but his reason is also incapable of seeking God. In other words, faith is not only something we believe, it also has to be something we do, because faith is not verified by logic. Rather, faith is verified by life, by living a life compatible with one's stated beliefs. To observe God's commandments means to express faith in the form of a deed. Similarly, when a person says, "I love you" to another person, the proof of that statement is not its logical validity. Rather, the proof of that statement is the performance of deeds that are consistent with that claim. And so in prayer, what we do is we state our faith commitment, and how we act, how we live, demonstrates whether we are what we pray and whether we do what we say. Faith, on the one hand, is an inheritance. It's a legacy given to the present from the past. But to be complete, faith must be renewed. It must be reaffirmed by every person in every generation. In matters of faith, one should try to be a pioneer, but before a person can become a pioneer, one has to first become an heir. Rabbi Samuel Edels was the greatest Talmudic commentator in 17th century Poland. He was born in Krakow in 1575, and he served as a rabbi in Ostrog until his death in 1632. Edels reformulated earlier views that taught that the life of piety, namely the spiritual life, has three fundamental components. One, the individual's relationship with God. Two, the individual's relationship with his or her own self. And three, the individual's relationship with others. In other words, Jewish spirituality, in his view, has a theological component, a personal component, and an interpersonal or social component. The popular contemporary view in America today, that spirituality focuses only on individual spiritual self-development and neglects, therefore, the dimensions of interpersonal relations or of social ethics, is unfounded. Is not compatible with Jewish spirituality. 19th century Jewish thought in Poland stressed communal responsibility and interpersonal relations, the third of the three aspects of Jewish spirituality that I mentioned. And to give an example of this, listen to this story about Rabbi Moses of Sasaf. It's a very famous Hasidic story. It was the eve of Yom Kippur. The people of the town had gathered together in the synagogue waiting for the service to begin. In the synagogue, only one seat was empty, the seat of the rabbi. Without him, how could the service begin? The people waited, and they waited, but still he did not come. Now in the synagogue, a young mother sat in her seat, and she worried. Not about the rabbi, but about her sleeping child left alone in her house nearby. What, she thought, if the child awoke and found itself alone? The child would be frightened. The mother waited, but now she could no longer wait for the rabbi. So she left her seat in the synagogue and she ran home. She entered the room where the child slept, and her eyes automatically gazed at the crib, but the crib was empty. The child was gone. Her thoughts immediately raced with ideas about what terrible fate her child had met. Stricken with panic, she was about to scream, when all of a sudden she heard a familiar voice say, "Don't scream, for you will waken the baby." The voice came from an old thin man with a long white beard, and the man, of course, was none other than the rabbi. And the rabbi said to her, "I was on my way to the synagogue when I heard a child crying in your house. I entered the house, but nobody was there. The child had awoken and, not finding you there, began to cry. So," said the rabbi, "I played with the child for a while, and then I sang the child to sleep, and I've been holding the child, sleeping, while I'm waiting for you, so I can go to the synagogue now to begin the prayers." What is the moral of the story? The moral of the story is that service to others takes precedence over service to God, because service to others is service to God. And now, before I move toward a conclusion and link the past with the present, one more story, Hasidic and very well known. And it goes like this. When the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, was challenged by a seemingly insurmountable task, he would go to a certain place in the forest. He would light a fire, and he would meditate in prayer, and what he had set out to perform would be accomplished. In the next generation, after him, his successor, the Maggid of Mezrich, when he encountered a similar challenge, he would journey to the same place in the forest that the Baal Shem Tov had gone, and he would say, "We can no longer light the fire because we don't know how to light this kind of fire. But we can recite the same prayers." And what he wanted to be done was accomplished. Then in the next generation, Rabbi Moses of Sasaf went to the very spot in the forest where the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid of Mezrich used to go, and he said, "We no longer know how to light the fire, and we no longer know the correct meditation on the prayers. But what we do know is the place in the forest to which all these things belong, and that must be for us enough." And then finally in the following generation, when Rabbi Israel of Rizhin was called upon to perform a difficult task, he sat in his home and he said, "We cannot light the fire. We don't anymore know the prayers. We don't even know the location of the place in the forest. So all we can do is to retell the tale of how all of this was once done, and for us, in this generation, that must suffice." For us, what does this tale mean? It means that Jews no longer dwell in any numbers in the places where the spiritual heritage of Polish Jewry was created, because most of Polish Jewry was consumed by a pillar of fire and smoke. We no longer know even their resting place, because most of their physical remains have been obliterated. We no longer embody the flame. We no longer know how to light the fire of their religious fervor, of their spiritual achievements, and we can no longer perform many forms of their sacred worship. So what in this generation can we do? What we can do is what Israel of Rizhin did. We can still tell what we know of their tale. We can still convey what we know of their teachings. We can still employ what has been preserved of their wisdom. And perhaps in telling that tale, in reclaiming that legacy, in transmitting that wisdom, and in applying those teachings, we can yet recover some sacred sparks from the ashes that remain. Perhaps in the lands where the descendants of Polish Jewry now dwells, like Israel and America, we may discover new sacred spots, new sanctified moments. Perhaps by applying the remnants of the treasure trove of Polish Jewry of spiritual insight to our situation, perhaps that way their legacy may become transmigrated and transmitted to live yet again, and thereby to acquire a life after death. For as the Baal Shem Tov taught, the spiritual life is like a bed of coals, and as long as a single spark remains, a great fire may yet be rekindled. But without that spark, if we lose that spark, it will be impossible for us to rekindle the flame. The spiritual riches of East European Jewry in general, and of Polish Jewry in particular, are much, much more extensive than I've had time to depict here today, and what I've offered are only a few nuggets from a huge treasure trove of the cumulative wisdom of many centuries. I have focused today most of my attention on Hasidic teachings, mostly on Polish Hasidic teachings, because in many ways Hasidism represents the quintessence, the summation, the coalescence of the Jewish spiritual heritage that preceded its emergence in 18th century Eastern Europe. Or, to put it another way, as one prominent Israeli rabbi once said, the religion that's closest to Judaism is Hasidism. Yet there are still many more minds to excavate to see the splendor of the spiritual heritage of East European Jewry in all its magnificence. There are many resources from that treasure trove that can help us address the perplexities that confront us today. And in my view, becoming aware, studying, and incorporating the legacy of Polish Jewry into our own lives is a critical key for us today in the American Jewish community in our desperate quest to help ensure Jewish continuity. And moving now to a conclusion, I want to focus on why I believe this is the case. Why the spiritual legacy of Polish Jewry has the key for ensuring the future of American Jewry. In 1939, on the eve of the Holocaust, 84% of all Jews in the world, 84%, were either living in the old Polish lands or were descended from Jews who lived there. Today, about 50% of the Jews in Israel and at least 75% of American Jewry can trace their ancestry to Jews who lived in the historical lands of the Kingdom of Poland. Nonetheless, as the eminent Jewish theologian Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote in 1963, and I quote, "Modern Jewish leaders have no understanding of our roots. This is the main tragedy of our generation. How can we expect the tree to bloom without roots? Knowing and not forgetting the source, the crown of Jewry, namely East European Jewry, is, says Heschel, the primary task for American Jewry." In other words, for Heschel, our detachment from the spiritual roots of East European Jewry has made American Jewry like a messenger who has forgotten his message, like a tree who has severed its own roots. Indeed, I would further suggest that it is precisely for this reason that most of our commissions on Jewish continuity and many of our obsessive communal efforts to help ensure Jewish continuity have simply missed the point. Because by definition, continuity means the continuation of what went before. According to Webster's dictionary, continuity denotes an uninterrupted connection or succession, persistence without essential change. And therefore, Jewish continuity means the perpetuation of the chain of tradition that we have inherited from our forebears. And for most American Jews, our forebears originally came from the historical lands of Poland. For American Jewry today, the key to Jewish continuity, it seems to me, is to reforge our genealogical, historical, and spiritual link with the precious legacy of East European Jewry that each of us has inherited from our forebears, and that the key to continuity is simply to continue the spiritual legacy of East European Jewry that we have inherited, that is our birthright. Yet, what have we done to preserve that spiritual legacy? What do we know of that spiritual legacy? For how many generations have we disparaged the traditions of East European Jewry? As Heschel put it, we have been too blinded by the light of our environment in the West to appreciate the value of the fire of the lamp of our eternal light. We have invested phenomenal efforts and stupendous amounts of money preserving the memories of how Jews died in Poland during the Holocaust. But the key to continuity is not in knowing how Jews died, but in perpetuating how Jews lived. It is not in knowing what was done to us, but rather in knowing what we did, in becoming aware of the arias of ideas, the spiritual insights, the intellectual virtuosity, and the precious legacy that we, Jews, created in Eastern Europe, which is a legacy unparalleled in Jewish history since the time of the Talmud. It is the real golden age of Jewish history. Now, no sane person would squander a legacy of unimaginable physical riches. Why then do we neglect? Why then do we squander and ignore this legacy of immeasurable spiritual and intellectual riches? Why have we neglected this crucial key to Jewish continuity, whereby the cumulative wisdom of the past can inform the perplexities of the present, and with which we can forge a link in the present between our Jewish past and with our Jewish future? The question that confronts us, of which the Baal Shem Tov spoke, is the question of whether the spark has been extinguished. The question that confronts us is, will American Jewry choose to ignore the spark or to reignite the spark? This, it seems to me, is the challenge and the choice before us. And one choice can ensure Jewish authenticity and continuity, while the other choice, not to ignite the fire, can engender spiritual disintegration, or perhaps even worse. I now conclude with the words of my mentor, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, from his Paean to East European Jewry, which he wrote soon after the Holocaust and which is found in English in his book, The Earth is the Lord's. Heschel wrote, and I quote, "A world has vanished. All that remains is a sanctuary hidden in the realm of the Spirit. We, of this generation, are still holding the key. Unless we remember, unless we unlock it, the holiness of the ages will remain a secret of God. We still hold the key to the sanctuary. And the tasks begun by the patriarchs and the prophets and continued by their descendants are now entrusted to us. We are either the last Jews, or we are those Jews who will hand over the entire past to generations to come. We will either forfeit, or we will further enrich the legacy we have inherited from the ages." Thank you.